Texas, May 19th, 1836. A 17-year-old girl watches her father-in-law's skull cave in from a war club. Her mother-in-law collapses into the dirt, stabbed and bleeding. Before she can scream, warriors are already on her, lifting her onto a horse, carrying her into the darkness. She is 6 months pregnant. Her name is Rachel Plummer, and what happens to her over the next 21 months is so horrific that years later, safe, home, writing her own memoir with her own hand, she still couldn't bring herself to describe it fully. She wrote only this: "To undertake to narrate their treatment would only add to my present distress, for it is with feelings of the deepest mortification that I think of it, much less speak or write of it." Rachel Plummer was not alone. She was one of thousands, as what comes next, your history teacher never mentioned. The raids followed a pattern so disciplined it was almost mechanical. Always dawn, always dusk, always when the light was wrong and the eyes were slow. Isolated homesteads, families living miles from the nearest neighbor with no one to hear them scream, were the preferred targets. The men died first. Husbands, fathers, older brothers, any boy tall enough to hold a rifle. It happened in minutes, sometimes less. There was no warning, no negotiation, no hesitation. Then the selection began. Women of childbearing age were the highest value. They could work. They could be traded to Mexican slave markets operating in the northern territories. They could be taken as wives, bear children who would grow up speaking Comanche, remembering nothing of a former life. Young girls under 10 were prized almost as highly. Give them enough time, and they would forget entirely. Language, identity, family, all of it erasable. The elderly were killed on the spot. They couldn't work, couldn't bear children, and couldn't keep pace on the long ride back to camp. Infants were killed too. A crying baby could betray the group's location to pursuers. The selection was ruthless, efficient, stripped of any emotion whatsoever. Olive Oatman was 14 years old when warriors attacked her family near the Gila River in Arizona, February 1851. Her family had been traveling west with a larger group of settlers, but after arguments over the route, the Oatmans had pressed on alone, convinced they were only days from safety. They were wrong. Olive watched her father beaten to death with clubs, her mother killed beside him, her older sister, her baby brother. 4 of her siblings murdered in the space of minutes while she stood frozen, unable to move, unable to make a sound. When the killing stopped, only Olive and her 7-year-old sister Mary Ann were still standing. The warriors dragged them into the desert. Olive later described walking barefoot through the wilderness for an entire night. Sharp rocks slicing open her feet, cactus spines embedding themselves in her skin with every step. No food, no water, no rest. Every time she stumbled from exhaustion, she was struck with a club. Every time she slowed, she was beaten until she moved faster. Her 7-year-old sister walked beside her, bleeding, too terrified to cry, too exhausted to speak. By dawn, Olive's feet were so torn and swollen that every step felt like walking on broken glass. But stopping meant dying. And this was only the first night. Once captives reached camp, their new existence began immediately. They were not guests awaiting rescue. They were not prisoners awaiting ransom. They were property. Work began the first day, before wounds had healed, before they had eaten, before they had slept. Gathering firewood until hands cracked and bled, hauling heavy clay vessels of water for miles under the desert sun, scraping animal hides until fingers were raw, digging for roots in rock-hard soil. Every task too menial or too exhausting for anyone else became theirs. They ate last, whatever scraps remained after the entire tribe had finished. If a hunt had been poor, there were no scraps. They slept on empty stomachs and woke before dawn to do it again. Rachel Plummer wrote about her first months in captivity. I was kept constantly at work from earliest dawn until late at night. When I failed to perform my tasks to their satisfaction, I was beaten with clubs and sticks. My life was one of constant dread, suffering, and misery. The beatings came without warning, for working too slowly, for showing exhaustion, for crying, for speaking English to another captive, sometimes for no reason at all, simply because they were there, simply because they were powerless, simply because no one was watching. Matilda Lockhart was 13 years old when she was captured by Comanche raiders in Texas in 1838. A farmer's daughter, a child who had never harmed anyone. She spent 2 years in captivity. When she was finally returned during peace negotiations in San Antonio in March 1840, the Texan authorities who received her could barely speak. Hardened frontier men who had seen violence their entire lives stood in silent shock. A woman named Mary Maverick helped bathe and dress Matilda after her release. She later wrote in her diary what she saw. Her head, arms, and face were full of bruises and sores. Her nose was actually burnt off to the bone, all the fleshy end gone, and a great scab formed on the end of the bone. Both nostrils were wide open and denuded of flesh. Matilda, barely whispering, explained what had happened. The women of the tribe had made a game of tormenting her. They would wake her from sleep by pressing burning sticks against her face. Her nose was their favorite target, night after night, week after week, month after month. Her screams entertained them. The smell of her burning flesh made them laugh. By the end, there was simply nothing left to burn. Her entire body was covered with similar marks, burns on her arms, her back, her legs. Evidence of cruelty so systematic that it went far beyond punishment, far beyond discipline, into something darker that served no purpose except suffering itself. Mary Maverick wrote that Matilda was utterly degraded and could not hold up her head again. She never recovered, not physically, not mentally, not in any way that mattered. Matilda Lockhart died 2 years after her rescue. She was 15 years old. There was a ritual captives faced from the very first day. It was designed not to kill, but to break. The gauntlet. The captive was forced to run between 2 long rows of warriors armed with clubs, whips, sticks, and anything else that could inflict pain. Every person in those rows struck them as they passed. Those who fell were beaten until they stood. Those who couldn't stand faced worse. It served multiple purposes. It was entertainment, a celebration of a successful raid. It was a demonstration of power, a lesson in the captive's new place in the world. And it was a test. Those who showed courage, who refused to cry out, who kept running no matter how many times they were struck, sometimes earned marginally better treatment afterward. Those who showed weakness only invited more. Rachel Plummer endured the gauntlet multiple times during her 21 months in captivity. Through brutal experience, she learned the only thing that seemed to work. They respected bravery more than anything, she wrote years later. I wish I had known it sooner. By the end of her captivity, Rachel had stopped being a victim. When one of her captors attacked her, she fought back so ferociously, beat the woman so severely, that the warriors standing nearby laughed and cheered. They admired her spirit, her refusal to break. From that day forward, her treatment improved. Most captives never discovered this. They remained victims, growing weaker every day until they died in captivity or were ransomed back to families who barely recognized them. Some women faced a different fate entirely. They were taken as wives. This might sound like better treatment. In some ways, it was. A wife ate with the tribe rather than on scraps. She faced less random violence. She had a defined place in the social order. But she had no choice. None whatsoever. Young women were given to warriors as prizes, rewards for successful raids. They were expected to fulfill every duty a wife fulfilled. Resistance was met with violence, and the violence continued until resistance stopped. Some women eventually accepted their new lives, not because they chose to, but because acceptance was the only way to survive. Cynthia Ann Parker was 9 years old when she was taken in the same raid that captured Rachel Plummer, the attack on Fort Parker, that same May morning in 1836. Just a child. But Cynthia Ann didn't spend 21 months in captivity like Rachel. She spent 24 years. She grew up Comanche, learned the language, absorbed every custom. She married a war chief named Pita Nocona and had 3 children, a daughter she called Prairie Flower, and 2 sons, one of whom would become Quanah Parker, the last great chief of the Comanche people. By every account, Cynthia Ann loved her husband, loved her children, loved the life she had built. When Texas Rangers tracked her down in December 1860, she didn't want to be rescued. She fought them, screamed for her husband, begged to stay. They took her anyway. Her husband was killed in the raid or died shortly after from wounds. Accounts differ. Her sons escaped into the wilderness. She never saw them again. Only her infant daughter came with her. And here is the part history rarely tells. The rescue was a second captivity. Cynthia Ann spent the remaining 10 years of her life trying to escape back to the Comanches, back to her sons, back to everything she knew. She was watched constantly, guarded by relatives who believed they were helping her. She died in 1870. Some historians believe she simply stopped eating after Prairie Flower died of influenza, that she chose death over a life among people who had become strangers to her. She had been saved from the only family she remembered, and it destroyed her. Perhaps nothing reveals the true horror of frontier captivity more than what happened to children. Rachel Plummer's 2-year-old son James was torn from her arms during the raid on Fort Parker. She never saw him during her captivity, but it was her second child who haunts history most. Rachel gave birth to a son 6 months into captivity. For 6 weeks, she cared for him as best she could. Then the warriors decided the infant was slowing her work. She wrote, "They took my child from me. I never saw him alive again." She was 20 years old. Rachel Plummer was eventually ransomed. When her father finally saw her, he barely recognized his own daughter. She was emaciated, covered in scars. Something lived behind her eyes that hadn't been there before. She wrote her memoir, one of the first captivity narratives published in Texas. She became pregnant again. She gave birth to a healthy son. She died 2 months later. Her body simply gave out. Her son James, the 2-year-old torn from her arms, was ransomed and returned in 1842. He was 8 years old by then. He had been among the Comanche long enough to forget his birth family completely. Olive Oatman was released after 5 years with the Mojave tribe. Unlike her brutal treatment under the Yavapai, her time with the Mojave had been more complex. They had adopted her, given her land to farm, tattooed her chin with their sacred blue markings, 5 lines that would follow her for the rest of her life. But she was still a captive. She could not leave. When she walked into Fort Yuma in 1856, she weighed barely 80 pounds. English came back to her slowly, painfully, like words being translated from a language she now thought in more naturally. and across her chin, those 5 blue lines announced to everyone she would ever meet: stranger, neighbor, husband, stranger again. Exactly where she had been. Olive became famous. Lecture tours, a published book, a symbol of frontier survival. She married a cattleman. She lived quietly in Texas for decades, but she never fully came back. Her husband reportedly spent years buying and burning every copy of her memoir he could find, trying to give her peace from a past that wouldn't release its grip. She kept a jar of Mojave mesquite seeds on her shelf until the day she died, a small reminder of a world she could never fully leave behind. By the 1870s, historians estimate that at least 30% of Comanche, Kiowa, and Apache populations had captive ancestry. The line between settler and native was far blurrier than 19th century newspapers wanted to admit. Some captives became fully assimilated, learned the language, married warriors, bore children with no memory of any other life. When rescue parties finally found them, they refused to leave. They had become someone else, and that someone else didn't want to go back. Others emerged as walking wounded, people who flinched at sudden movement, who woke screaming for decades after their rescue, who could never explain to their families what had really happened out there, because the words simply didn't exist. And thousands more simply disappeared, taken in raids and never seen again. No memoirs, no testimonies, no graves for families to visit. Just names in faded ledgers and people who spent the rest of their lives waiting for news that never came. The American frontier was not an adventure. It was not a story of triumph or discovery or destiny. It was a place of brutal, uncompromising survival, where everyone on every side committed acts that would haunt the land for generations. These women survived what shouldn't be survivable. They endured what shouldn't be endurable. They came back when so many others didn't, and they left behind something no one could take from them. Their words: Rachel Plummer, Matilda Lockhart, Olive Oatman, Cynthia Ann Parker. History calls them victims, and they were, every single one of them. But they were also witnesses, and witnesses, if we're willing to listen, force us to remember the truth about who we were and who we still are. If these stories matter to you, if you believe they deserve to be heard, subscribe to The Mysterious History.